Okay, 2 nights ago the story came from here. Today the story is real. I worked with gifted children for many years. And anybody who thinks that gifted children do not have real issues has not really worked with gifted children. Here's the norm. There's the standard deviation. Here's another standard deviation. Kids with IQs of 70 have problems. Kids with 120, 130, 140, 150 begin to have severe problems. So I taught small classes. And I would take the kids out of their classrooms, work with them for an hour. And I had one child. I hope this is not sacrilegious. I had one child. Her name was Tiffany. Tiffany was in 5th grade, highest grade you can get to in the school that I taught. And I couldn't go any higher myself, probably. At any rate, Tiffany, large girl, very large girl, very ungainly, not particularly pleasant, and not particularly well-liked. Tiffany, seriously, would sit in the library like this. Later on, found out her father was a drug lord in town. There were always, people there, drugs. Who knows what the heck this girl saw? I came to her school one week. I went once a week to see this group of kids. And this is what I hear. Tiffany is on the top of the roof, and she's threatening to jump. And the firemen have been called out. Somebody, I don't know if it was the principal or whatever, finally got on the roof, pulled her back, and she's screaming and crying, "Let me jump, let me jump, let me jump." That's my So as the year went on, Tiffany made a couple suicide attempts. She would burst into tears in the middle of class. And then a miracle happened. About 3 months before school was over, Tiffany started calming down. She actually sat down like a person. She started taking part in conversations. Her inner core started coming out. This was a child who had so much wisdom because of all of her hardships. And she became just a scintillating jewel. So, of course, who takes the credit? Yours truly. I am such a great teacher. I had pulled all these wonderful things out of my little Tiffany. The social worker took the credit. No, it was me. It was me. I worked with her every week for a year. That's she's my creation. Teacher took the credit. Oh, no. I went to a conference. I found out how to work with emotionally disturbed children. Tiffany's mine. Well, I don't know why, but at the end of that year, I asked the kids to leave books of wisdom because they were moving into 6th grade. They were graduating. They were the big guys. And so I asked them to leave wisdom for the young guys coming up, the young kids. So as different activities were going on in the back of the room, the side of the room, I would be at the computer. The children would come over, and they would tell me their stories. And one of the pieces that I wanted them to do was to leave thank yous, so that other children understood how important the concept of gratitude was. So the kids would say all these, pretty expected things, and then comes Tiffany. Tiffany sits down next to me, and she says, "I want to thank Ellie." Well, Ellie, Tiffany's big. Ellie is this little elf of a child, very fragile, with a punum, a face that you could just eat up. And she said, "Do you know what Ellie did? 3 months ago," this is when we all started congratulating ourselves. 3 months ago on the playground, Ellie would come up to me and she would take me, this is Arizona, we don't have many trees. She would take me to a tree and she would tell me this was the secret tree. And she told me that I could tell her as many secrets as I wanted. It's a 5th grader, 9 years old. And I started talking to Ellie. And Ellie listened. She heard me. She listened. And I've been feeling better and better and better. That was Tiffany's story. Another few minutes later comes Ellie. Ellie sits down and she says, I want to thank Mrs. Jensen. Now, Mrs. Jensen is one of the most disliked teachers in the whole school. Or she was. She had a loud voice. She was kind of in your face all the time, asking you questions, and she was a nervous talker, and she talked like this, and she'd go on and on and on and on and on. However, Ellie said, my mother had left my father when we lived in Hawaii. And she said, I was very sad and I was very angry. And Mrs. Jensen liked me. Mrs. Jensen would put her hand on my shoulder. Mrs. Jensen would tell me how pretty I looked. Mrs. Jensen would look at me and wink every once in a while. And I figured that if there's one, this is Ellie talking, little fragile Ellie. I figured if there's one person in this world who's nice, maybe there are other people who are also nice. So that started, Mrs. Jensen started Ellie's healing. And Ellie became a healer. At the time, I think this happened in 1st grade, the story she's telling me. So from the time she was 7, Ellie became a healer. And she would look for people who were not whole. So, there's Tiffany who's healing. There is Ellie who was broken and had healed enough so she could become a healer. But the story doesn't end there. The story ends about 3 weeks later. And I look in the back of the library where I'm working, and there's Mrs. Jensen. And Mrs. Jensen what had come in to be a tutor to other children to help the kids read. And I went over to Mrs. Jensen, and I told her how her kindness to Ellie had passed on not only to many other children, but also to Tiffany, who at the beginning of the year had 1 foot over the abyss. And Mrs. Jensen started crying. She said, I thought my children did not like me. I thought I was hated. And you don't know what this story has meant to me. It starts with Mrs. Jensen, full circle. And she finally understood that maybe she didn't touch many children, but she touched one, and the ripples just